Hello and welcome. I don't know about you, but this Gandhi Jayanti felt different to me. Mostly this was because of the number of people on social media who did not just diss Gandhiji, but actually spoke up on behalf of his murderer. When you challenged them, they usually fell back on their old chestnut. Well, it's only fair to hear Nathuram Godse's side of the story. Like many people, I was appalled by the attempt to create some bogus equivalence between the father of the nation and a murderer. But it also made me wonder, where is this stuff coming from? How are we turning into a society where Godse suddenly gets so much prominence? I asked Shashi Tharoor, not in his capacity as a Congress leader, but as somebody who's written about this period, to explain the remarkable rise of Nathuram Godse. I began by asking Shashi where he thought this was coming from. Let's hear Godse's side of the story. You know, Godse may have had a point. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, there's been a long strain within the Hindutva tradition of attacking Gandhiji. In fact, it goes back to Savarkar and Golwalkar, in fact, who considered that Gandhiji's emphasis on non-violence and ahimsa was somehow unmanly and un-Hindu and so on. And then, of course, Godse, since you mentioned him, had a particular critique of Gandhi, that he was actually somebody who had stood up for the rights of Muslims when Muslims were attacking Hindus. His final fast, as you may remember, was to essentially oblige the government of India to pay Pakistan a large sum of money that was at least notionally due to it upon partition, and that the government of India was sitting on, especially given the Kashmir invasion and other such things. But the feeling on the part of people like Godse was, this man is catering to the other side and therefore must be got rid of. So this tradition has been there in the past. During the post-independence period, when Gandhiji was deified after his assassination, there was very much a soft peddling. The critics of Gandhiji, those who sort of privately may have admired Godse, did not express it publicly. Their hatred was brushed under the carpet. And say, if you look back on the centenary of Gandhiji's birth in 1969, there was consensual universal acclaim and admiration. Then the big Attenborough film, the whole thing, everything goes very well. When do these chaps start coming out of the woodwork again? When suddenly the BJP comes into the ascendant. And what's particularly interesting is that the Prime Minister himself has actually adopted Gandhiji as an icon of his new India. He is constantly expressing adulation for Gandhiji. He is constantly paying obeisance to statues of Gandhi, commemorating Gandhi's things. The Swachh Bharat campaign is conducted with a logo of Gandhiji's glasses, and Swachhata is something that Gandhiji is identified with, and the Prime Minister says so. So there is a dissonance between this official, if you like, governmental embrace of Gandhiji and the unofficial party or ideology's distaste for Gandhiji. And that dissonance could well mean that this is what people really feel, and that's essentially what the government feels it ought to show. You know, why throw away a good brand for your country and your government, but privately you can continue encouraging people to say these things. You'll all remember the horror when I think it was Sakshi Maharaj, the MP, said that on the 30th of January there should be statues of Godse erected throughout the country. And for many of us, this was the most unthinkable, let alone unsayable thing. And here you have an MP of the ruling party, somebody who leads debates for the ruling party, somebody who chairs a committee in Parliament for the ruling party, saying a thing like this. So now it's well and truly out there how they really feel.
Let me ask you a question now, not as a congressman, but as a historian, as a person who's written about that period. You say that there was always a strain that opposed Gandhiji within Hindu nationalism. Explain that, expand on that a little bit.
Well, Gandhiji took up nationalism, as it were, after coming from South Africa, where he had really acquired renown for his spiritual thinking, as well as indeed for standing up for the rights of the Indians, the Indian community of South Africa, beginning to suffer from what became essentially incipient apartheid later. And so he had both a spiritual, self-reflective side to him and this social/political activism to him as well. He was the first political figure of any sort to say that means must be worthy of the ends. So if you have noble ends, but you have unjust means, and your ends are vitiated. So he calls off the non-cooperation movement after the attack on the police station in Chauri Chaura, because there's a bad means being used, even if the end of Indian freedom is a desirable one. All of these moral, spiritual things come in. Now, initially, of course, people are rather taken up with his ability to galvanize the masses. But particularly after things like calling off the agitation, his spinning, his reflection and so on, some people say, well, this is not enough for us. They include his own admirers, people like Jawaharlal Nehru, very often impatient and expresses his impatience in letters to Gandhiji and in statements. It includes people like Bose, who had always been captivated by some of the military aspects of nationalist behavior in Europe. And he, at an early Congress session in the 1920s, organized a bunch of people to wear quasi-military uniforms and march and parade and so on. So he already had a slightly more militarized version of nationalism coming there. And then you had the people who were outside the Congress or heading outside the Congress. For a long time, some Hindu Mahasabha members were in the Congress, but increasingly there was a strain outside the Congress that strongly spoke for Hindutva. And of course, the founding of the RSS in 1922 meant that the RSS elements...
The Hindu Mahasabha predates the RSS.
Yeah, the Hindu Mahasabha actually was both a social movement and a political party, but one of very little electoral appeal because the bulk of Hindus voted for the Congress anyway. The RSS was set up very specifically as a kind of organized cadre force, a volunteer force, as the very name implies. Swayamsevaks are volunteers. And they had the strong ideology of Hindutva. And they spoke about India as a land for Hindus, and Hindus defined as people for whom this country is their Matrabhumi, their motherland, their Pitrabhumi, the land of their ancestors, and their Punyabhumi, the land of their faith. Which meant that whereas Hindus, obviously their faith is from here, and even Sikhs, Buddhists and Jains can claim that India is their Punyabhumi, Muslims and Christians could not. Nor could Parsis and Jews, but Parsis and Jews were admitted as guests. Okay. Muslims and Christians were seen as foreign objects sort of injected into the Indian fabric. Now this vision is something which the RSS articulated, first of all in Savarkar's writings and speeches, and then in Golwalkar.
Was Savarkar just Hindu Mahasabha or was he RSS as well? Because there is some dispute now as to where he belonged.
I know. In fact, I haven't gone into it in sufficient detail to give you a definitive answer. But there is no doubt in my mind that he is certainly one of the founts of RSS thinking.
Well, the BJP government, last BJP government, did put a picture of him up in Parliament. So
yeah, exactly. And
so they do venerate him.
That's right, they venerate him. And Golwalkar builds on Savarkar's Hindutva and takes it forward. So Golwalkar, who is the Sarsang Chalak of the RSS, is somebody who's very much basing his theories. If you look at, there's a book called We or Our Nationhood Defined. And his idea of India's nationhood is really not very dissimilar to Savarkar's. In fact, if something, one major difference is whether, as Savarkar sees it, Hinduism is culture rather than religion, or as Golwalkar sees it, it's religion with culture as a subset. These are minor sort of technical details. Largely speaking, it's the same sort of vision. So it's a distinction without a difference.
What did the Hindu strain object to about Gandhi?
There were a number of factors. First of all, the Hindu strain objected to Gandhi's non-violence and so on. They felt one had to be tough and manly and so on and so forth. I mean, the RSS is busy wearing khaki shorts and parading with lathis and staves, whereas Gandhiji is conducting bhajans. I mean, there's this complete contrast in sort of method and approach. Secondly, they felt Gandhiji was too eclectic, that he was very open to other faiths. As you know, in these bhajans, there's also songs from other faiths. There's Muslim recitations of verses from the Quran, there's Christian hymns, there's all sorts of religions, of course, Sikh and Jain and so on, Buddhist very commonly. And then even the language of some of the Hindu, sort of seemingly Hindu bhajans is very much universalist. So, Ishwar Allah Tero Naam, Sabko Samajhe De Bhagwan. There is a message saying that we're all together in this. That they didn't like. And in fact, if you want to see where the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS really stand, it's as a mirror image of the Muslim League. You've got bigotry on both sides. So there are Muslim bigots, there are Hindu bigots. And then there are both Hindus and Muslims who are not bigots and are working together in the Indian National Congress. That's the essential.
So where would you place Godse? Is he part of the Hindu Mahasabha strain?
Very much. He was in the Hindu Mahasabha, he was in the RSS also. He did quit before the assassination. Whether he quit, as some suggest, or as many suggest, merely to give the RSS the fig leaf of denial, or whether he quit because he felt even the RSS wasn't going far enough against Gandhiji and what he stood for, that's a matter of interpretation and debate. Records from that period would suggest that the quitting was perhaps largely a fig leaf. But I don't want to sit here and theorize because after all,
But it's
there are
fair-
court cases on this issue going on.
But it's fair to say that after the assassination, Sardar Patel, again a great BJP icon, banned the RSS because of fears that there might be sympathies towards the assassination.
Not just that, Patel actually said that they had unleashed the climate of intolerance and hatred which had essentially enabled the assassin to do his dirty work. I'm not using his exact words, but it's a fairly accurate paraphrase of why Sardar Patel decided to ban the RSS. At the same time, it's, in all fairness, it was said that he didn't take him very long, a couple of years, to unban them, on condition that they stayed away from politics and they just conducted a cultural renaissance, if you like, of the
Which, of course, is what they're still doing.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I think it's difficult to see the RSS purely in cultural terms because the Bharatiya Jansangh was founded by Shyama Prasad Mukherjee very much with the blessing of the RSS leadership of the time. He quit the Hindu Mahasabha, of which he had been president, to start a wholly new organization. Many meaning to be a national political party.
I'll stop you there because one of the things that comes up again and again on social media is people haven't heard Godse's side of the story. Godse made a speech, he's written documents. What is Godse's side of the story? So what was Godse's side of the story? That's after the break. Don't go away. Welcome back. We've all heard a certain amount in recent years about giving a fair say to Nathuram Godse, the murderer of Mahatma Gandhi. What, I asked Shashi Tharoor, was Godse's side of the story?
Godse's side of the story is pretty much that. Of course, there is a larger critique that Hindu interests were being neglected by the nationalist movement, particularly by Gandhiji. There is an inclination to blame Indian leaders, Hindu leaders, for giving in to partition and having allowed the vivisection of the motherland. Then there is a decline.
Gandhiji was, of course, bitterly opposed to it.
Of course, he was opposed to it. It's silly. And there is also the question of the non-violence and all of that. And finally, the appeasement of Muslims and of Pakistan. That phrase which we hear so much today was implicit. I can't remember if the specific word was used, was implicit in Godse's critique. I gather somebody has just conducted an RTI inquiry to get the actual transcript of what he said in court, because in fact all we have of Godse's famous speech is what his brother recounted and wrote after the hanging of Godse. So it's not, as far as I am aware, it is not an authentic transcript of what he actually said in the courtroom. But I gather somebody has conducted an RTI inquiry to try and get that. And if there is a transcript on the record in some dusty courtroom somewhere, no doubt we'll get a fuller picture of his views. Those who want to honor Godse, therefore, want to honor an entire way of thinking about India, about partition, about Hinduism, and about the nature of this country in which Hindus are a majority. That's what it's all about.
Explain the dissonance to me. Gandhiji is a hero in Mr. Modi's world. As you said, he uses the symbols of Gandhiji. He refers to Gandhiji again and again. He makes much of the fact that Gandhiji was a Gujarati. He calls him Gujarat ka chokra, etc. Yet, on the other hand, the head of the BJP IT cell, not this year but some years ago, raised the whole issue of Godse and said he's got to be heard. Many people, many of whom are followed by the Prime Minister on Twitter, have been tweeting things that are sympathetic to Godse. How can you reconcile these two?
It's a difficult paradox to reconcile because in some ways Mr. Modi's and his cabinet's adulation of Gandhiji was a bit of a surprise. This is not something that has been a characteristic of the Hindutva movement at all. They have genuinely not tended to see Gandhiji as one of theirs or somebody they can be sympathetic to or admiring of. At the same time, it made a lot of sense because Gandhiji is the best known Indian, the most admired Indian in recent history, perhaps in all history in terms of global recognition and appeal. And it would be folly on the part of somebody as well tuned to things like brand recognition and name recognition and public image to forego all the advantages of association with this figure. It would be the equivalent of Yogi Adityanath disowning the Taj. His best best known, most remunerative, most revenue generating, biggest tourist attraction in his state, and he disowns it for bigoted reasons. I mean, if Modi ji as Prime Minister of India had done that to Gandhi, it would have been even worse than disowning the Taj. So to that degree, I think I see it as a sensible calculation rather than perhaps one animated by a great deal of conviction. On the other hand, it's difficult to challenge Mr. Modi's sincerity. He's raised it periodically from Swachh Bharat onwards, as I said. He keeps giving targets linked to Gandhiji's birthday. For example, we all know that he's talked about the 75th anniversary of India's independence in 2022, but he's also talked about the 150th anniversary of Gandhiji's birthday in 2019. So all of these things, I mean, he's got very much a desire to set Gandhiji up as a kind of lodestar and a yardstick against which to measure certain accomplishments that he's seeking to fulfill. And that suggests to me that it would be wrong of me to impute motives. And yet there is no doubt that once you scratch past the surface of what we're seeing with the Prime Minister and his cabinet, that most of his followers are profoundly critical of Mahatma Gandhi.
I think there's a perfect right to be critical of Mahatma Gandhi, but did you think a day would come when you were at school when Godse would be idolized and people would say, let's put up statues of Godse, Godse is much better than Gandhi?
I was in a state of shock when I heard that a BJP MP could actually call for statues to be set up of an assassin. Let's not forget the only thing Godse is remembered for is an act of assassinating another human being, not something that, it's like Americans saying, yeah, so great about Lincoln, but let's set up a statue to John Wilkes Booth. I mean, it's absurd.
Or let's hear Booth's side of the story.
Let's hear Booth's side of the story.
So what does this tell us about India today?
It tells us there are some very fundamental assumptions of our nationhood being questioned. For example, I mentioned Savarkar and Golwalkar. I haven't even mentioned Deen Dayal Upadhyay, who was, of course, well after Godse, but who has, amongst other things, shared completely the Savarkar-Golwalkar critique of the nature of the Indian state, and then gone beyond to say that the Constitution itself, the Constitution of India, is actually a bad document because it reflects Western influence rather than being authentically true to the Hindu sensibility. So a true follower of Deen Dayal Upadhyay, as everybody in the government claims to be, should actually not be swearing by the Constitution. There is the Prime Minister saying, the Constitution is my only holy book, and in the same breath praising the very man who says the Constitution ought to be torn up and replaced. So there are contradictions in the ideology of this ruling movement, which can partly only be explained by expediency, that you pay lip service to certain things until you're ready to toss them aside.
Are you hopeful then that things will change? A whole new generation is growing up believing that Godse was this political opponent of Gandhi whose side of the story has not been told. What are the implications for the future of Indian secularism?
Well, first of all, I think there's no question in anyone's mind that Indian secularism in that sense is very much under threat. But at the same time, I have tremendous faith in the decency, integrity, and resilience of the Indian people. Because I see an India where people don't live this way, where people actually live with others of other communities, other faiths, where the whole nature of the kind of Hinduism we practice is one that's accommodating, one that's receptive. I mean, the very notion of Hinduism that you can imagine God any way you like. You can imagine him as a male figure with a trident. You can imagine as a female figure with 10 arms. So why not as a man suffering on a cross? Why not as anything else? I mean, ultimately, always, as Vivekananda said, Swamiji, of reaching out to God are equally valid. So that's the Hindu idea. It's very profoundly un-Hindu to interpret Hinduism in a way that excludes. It is an inclusive faith. So to my mind, I think the essential inclusivity of Hinduism is bound to reassert itself, because that's what the Indian people really are. Either the people who are now advocating a more bigoted view will eventually have to accommodate themselves to the reality of inclusive India, or they will be defeated starting at the polls. Which way the Indian people will go and when it will happen remains to be seen. But I have fundamentally faith that we will triumph in maintaining the essence of India, which it's always been for 3,000 years.
A final question, given that the Prime Minister obviously venerates and reveres Mahatma Gandhi, do you think it's incumbent on him to tell the people he follows on Twitter, tell the head of his social media cell that maybe they should go easy on the praise of Godse?
I think certainly there are a lot of things being done by people who claim to be fans and followers of the Prime Minister that it would be good for the Prime Minister to disavow sooner than he has done. Even his statements on things like the Ghar Wapasi controversy some years ago and the beef lynchings, the cow lynchings and cow vigilantism more recently have come after an inordinate wait. When people have been saying, this is awful, Prime Minister, why don't you stop it? He seems to wait till the last possible moment, 7-8 weeks after an episode. The same with the Rohit Vemula suicide. There's so many things where instead of seizing the moment, which he's normally very good at, of seizing the right time to respond immediately on something, on these matters he seems to really drag it out and allow these followers of his to behave in a disgraceful way, say the most outrageously offensive things, and then finally express some very mild disapproval at the end of the day. That isn't good enough. And I would certainly urge the Prime Minister to, on the question of Gandhiji, maybe at the next Gandhi Jayanti, since this one is now behind us, to actually in the lead up to Gandhi Jayanti, speak about why he admires Gandhiji, why Gandhiji is what he is saying he ought to be seen as, and thereby signal to his followers that they should not do the kinds of things and say the kinds of things that this year they felt they had the freedom to say. That if not directly encouraged, was at least being condoned by those in power in our country today.
Well, those are the facts. And it's important to remember them as the poison that motivated Godse flows through our streets again. We'll see you again next week. Till then, goodbye and take care.